In this video, we'll discuss the features on Johnny Cash's face that pointed to strong midlife energy, as well as his purpose-driven nature. Enjoy. Hey there, good people. Today, we've got Johnny Cash for our face reading. So, I just got back from Mexico, had a really nice time, so I'm feeling pretty good, ready to get back in the saddle. And I reached out to my friend, shout out to Nalini, for who I should read today. She suggested Johnny Cash. Someone else had mentioned Johnny Cash a while back as well. So, going to read him today and jump right in. So, a couple key things. Johnny Cash, as many of you know, phenomenal singer. One of the most iconic classic voices in the music industry. Had just a very soulful voice that everyone could get behind. And his voice was really powerful. I mean, it was a very signature thing. The thing to remember when we're talking about face reading and human expression and everything that comes out of the face is this idea that the tone of the voice reflects the quality of the spirit. So he had this deep, soulful voice, but Johnny Cash was also plagued by some very real demons. He had drug and alcohol problems, and we're going to look at some of those things in relation to his face because I think you can see some of that conflict, especially in his shen, or the spirit of the face. So the first thing that I noticed about Johnny Cash when I was looking at him is that he's got a really strong nose. And as he got older, his nose got very dominant. So when we think about the nose, this is the midlife portion. It's the midlife energy of the face. So the nose, as I've said before, it's the central mountain. But when we see a big dominant nose and there's a lot of strength in the nose, we're also seeing strength in the lung system. So for Johnny Cash, this fits in terms of his voice, right? The baritone quality. I don't know if he was a baritone, but I don't think he was. Maybe he was a tenor classically, but he had a very strong voice. So we see some congruency there in that strong nose. But then we also see this very interesting component of his face that has a little bit of mischief, and it shows up in the shen. There's kind of a smirk. There's a quirk to his face in some of these pictures that I was looking at where it looks like there's some fire that he's sitting on. And that's really interesting because, you know, when we look at a face and we see some of that mischief, we see some of that, that's usually fire related. Anything that's about mischief and getting into some stuff, getting into things that might cause a little bit of disruption, that's all fire energy, which he had. And in his younger pictures, you can definitely see this. But the thing that I want you to think about, okay, when we're looking at Johnny Cash is the quality of the shen. So even in his younger days, there's some pictures here when I was looking at him, there's some tension in that shen. There's a little bit of grit. There's a little bit of something in there that seems like there's some weight to it. The thing to think about with art and artists, especially when we're looking at people's faces and how they express their life force, is that a lot of artists are conflicted. A lot of artists, some of the best art is made from people who are going through very difficult things or who have been through really painful processes. And Johnny Cash's face definitely carries some of that. So you can see in some of these images that I'll cycle through, there's just this grit. There's something kind of old and weathered about that face. And again, I would argue that's part of why he made some good art. So when we look at people's faces, you know, you want to capture the feel. You want to look at a person's face and say, what am I feeling off that face? And so when we feel that and we can tune into that, we get a glimpse of how they should be expressing their life force to a degree. So the other thing in looking at his face, you know, he has this mark. He had this scar that shows up on his right side. So I thought that maybe was a natural marker. It's not. He had a cyst removed there. But it's interesting because when we get something like that on the face and it behaves sort of like a dimple, even though it's a scar, even though it's a cyst, it's on his public persona side. And this would kind of fall into like a dimple-like trait. And so when we see this, if we see a scar show up on the face, you know, the East is big on the idea of karma and how things come down the pike and how our life force expresses and how sometimes the things that are the blemishes that are left on our faces can actually be favorable because how we read the face subconsciously is going to be seen. It's going to be seen from others, and that has impact on how we express our life and our life terrain and our life force. So it's on his public persona side. Johnny Cash got a lot of attention. I find that interesting. He's also got a really square jaw. He's got a strong chin. There's a lot of willpower there. And so a lot of people who have that strong chin, okay, the chin relates to the kidney energy. It's a water element feature, and they call it zhi. Okay, it's spelled Z-H-I in Chinese. The zhi Okay, that willpower is critical for longevity. It's how we push through life. Now, people, if they have a strong chin like that, that's indicative of usually a strong kidney system. There's a real strong driving force for willpower, or the capacity for willpower. But the East also says we really need this. People need willpower to survive, to live a long time. Yes, the spiritual and yes, the emotional, all that stuff is really important, but you have to have a certain amount of grit to get through life. And his face was definitely kind of wired like this. Now, the other thing is, when you look at some of these photos, you can kind of see that conflict. There is that turmoil in the shin. There's a heaviness in his face that I find very interesting, but there's something very alluring about it. And this is where he kind of bridges into that seductive peach luck a little bit. There's something about his face that you want to look at a bit more, and that you're kind of like, what is his deal? What's he about? And so these are just some of the general traits, and like I see when I look at Johnny Cash and how his face expresses, that I find interesting. But there's something about his face that I like looking at too. And there's some big features. There's some crevices. He's got good wrinkles. He's got these nice purpose lines that were forming pretty early in life, and then into his older age. These lines here, that nasolabial groove, that relates to purpose. And the more carved those are, the more a person is pretty settled in what they're doing, and they feel usually pretty good about it. They've got some drive and determination in their purpose. So he has this. Now, when I was looking at his 3 sectors, I found this interesting, and I found some other people like this, but he's pretty much equal. Okay, the mental sphere from the top of the hairline to the eyebrows, that's that proportion. Then from the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose is pretty much the same distance. And then from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin is also the same distance. We're really close. So you're looking at the mental sphere up here, the practical sphere kind of in the middle, and then the emotional and instinctual on the lower portion. He has all 3 balanced. So people typically, when they hear that, they're like, oh, I'm balanced in all 3 of these sectors. That's great. Not necessarily. Things that are in balance can be sometimes difficult to balance. It's very zen. It's like straight but not straight. What that means is that when Johnny Cash, most likely when he was living his life, he probably struggled with decisions and like what to do with his life at certain times. When you have 3 balanced sectors like that, what that means is when you make a decision, or you're wanting to do something or take your life in a certain direction, you have all 3 of these pistons firing at the same time. That means your mental thinking process, your practical lens, and your emotional and instinctual are all firing at the exact same time. And that is often very problematic for people, because it's hard, because they don't know what to do. Do I do this or do I do that? Do I go down this road or do I do that? Or do I give up the drugs or do I not? It's hard for people to make a decision. When people are more dominant in their sectors, usually they have a bit more ease in making decisions, because they're just emotional and instinctual by nature. So they kind of fall into that. When you have all 3 balanced like that, one of the things I tell people in terms of lifestyle guidance, if I see these ratios on a person that I'm working with, I'll say, you need to look at a situation from one of those. You need to be explicitly logical about it, just be practical about it, or go with your gut instincts. You need to pick one and decide, that's what I'm going to do in this situation. And people are like, well, which one do I pick, right? The indecisive person, like, which one do I go with? I always say the one that creates the most ease in your body. So if you think, well, should I approach this situation logically? How much ease does that create in your body? Should I approach it strictly from a practical standpoint? How much ease does that create? And then ask, what if I just go with my gut instinct? How much ease does that create? That's the way you want to navigate it when you have these ratios. So if I was working with him as a lifestyle client, these are one of the attributes, or one of the metrics I would be putting on his radar in saying that. Last little thing that I noticed too is that he's got these integrated forehead lines across the top. So when we see these lines, okay, my forehead does this too. This represents the mind in the 20s specifically. And when we see those lines connect, what that means is, okay, when the lines show up on the forehead, typically that points to the lessons in the 20s were likely very difficult, the time of identity when we're figuring ourselves out. But when they connect like that, as we age, or even in your youth, in your 20s and 30s, if they're formed, that means that you integrated the lessons pretty well. And that's a good thing. Even if the lessons were very hard, okay, if they show up early in life, that means the lessons that you learned in your 20s were pretty hard. My forehead wrinkles showed up pretty early in life, and my 20s were pretty rough, and they were difficult because I lost my dad at 19. There were a lot of really hard lessons. I lost him at 19, but I had a lot of really difficult lessons show up. And they did integrate though. And I learned a lot and I'm better for it. And that's a double-edged sword. You know, you lose someone and there's a lot of growth that comes from it. But Johnny Cash has this trait as well. Those well-formed forehead lines, which means his thought processes were likely cohesive and his lessons of his 20s and his youth were likely integrated, even though they were very difficult. So these are the big things that I see on him. And the last little one is he's got this lifestyle depletion marker here, which makes a certain amount of sense given how harsh he was with his life force. There was a lot of drinking and a lot of drugs. So we see that pretty deeply carved into his life. And this is the thing to kind of think about when we're looking at people is you don't want to think about, well, you know, this person is good or bad for having lived the way they did. People just live. We all get to wield our life force the way we want to. But Johnny Cash, you know, has some marks. Like he lived life and he made a tremendous mark in the world. So I couldn't find a full frontal picture of him that was good enough for an inner persona. But the thing that I would have said for him as a lifestyle, you know, guidance, if I was working with him, is he's got some big water features, big open, broad forehead, big strong chin. He's got a big dominant nose. There was a certain amount of boldness that I would have encouraged him to live with as well. I wouldn't have encouraged him to drugs and alcohol, but when someone has these big, earthy, fleshy features that are dominant and they stand out and the face is unique, there's a certain amount of boldness they're going to need to lead their life force with, and that there's a certain amount of boldness that they will have to live and express. And his face definitely has this. There's just some grit, determination, and character in that face. And those are the things that I would be talking to him about. But again, when I'm working with someone privately, that process is a lot more involved because I'm asking questions. You do have to probe a little bit, but he's got some great features. So hope you like this reading. Let me know if there's someone else you'd like to read. Thanks.